Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another edition of the award winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Matt, welcome back.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, the hits just keep on coming. Last week, as we were talking about TD Bank, RTX, the company formerly known as Raytheon, settled a massive series of violations, one of which included the FCPA. There was a False Claims Act and an ITAR violation in there as well, but nearly $1 billion in overall fines. But I thought maybe for this episode, we could focus on the FCPA case. They had some real creativity in their bribery schemes. You want to outline the schemes because I can't call it scheme for us.
Yeah, this really is quite astonishing here. It's astonishing that Raytheon and most of this misconduct happened while RTX was still Raytheon. It merged with United Technologies Corporation, I believe, in 2018, and then they rebranded themselves as RTX in 2020. But this misconduct really did happen all the way back to, I think, around 2012 or so from Raytheon back then. So I'm going to refer to the entity as Raytheon throughout here. They, like you said, Tom, they had multiple offenses of U.S. law, multiple different types, export control and billing fraud and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. The violations here, on one hand, you'd think that they were similar to what we've heard before, use of third-party agents to arrange business contracts in the Middle East country of Qatar. Okay, third-party agents, that's not unusual. Then you dive really into the details of how they were using these agents, what these agents were demanding, who the agents were, how long this went on, and holy cow, RTX or Raytheon, they are a major defense contractor. They are no stranger to government regulation. This misconduct happened from at least 2012 clear into 2020. For large companies, it was not news that the FCPA was a thing that you had to worry about. Certainly by 2015 or so, at least, and yet Raytheon kept on doing this. So here is what happened. One scheme involved working with a extended family member of the Emir, who is the head of government in Qatar. And so this relative set up shop as a defense consultant. We all know what that means. It means he's a conduit for bribes. But this happened in, I want to say, the early 2020s, where Raytheon employees conjured up these sham defense studies that the defense agent was actually going to do, this defense consultant. He, of course, didn't actually do any work. He just took the money. I think it was for a total of, here it is, $2 million in bribe payments that went through this extended relative of the Emir to perform these sham defense studies, which were never done because this consultant had no actual skill to do it. $2 million went to the Emir's pockets, accounts somehow, in exchange for a deal for, I think it was a Patriot missile system. There was another scheme that was even more astonishing here, Tom, involving a person only identified as the Qatari agent. This person was, I believe, an immediate family member of the Emir, who basically just worked as a fixer. And from 2005 up through 2020, this agent was looking for shakedowns so that they could kick defense contracts for the Qatari Air Force to Raytheon. And Raytheon paid him, according to the SEC, a total of $30 million over the course of, I think, about 15 years or so. In exchange, Raytheon won billions of dollars in defense contracts. Tom, maybe we could get to this later on, but I'm still struggling on if disgorgement of ill-gotten gains is part of these settlements. Then if they won billions in defense contracts, why are they not paying billions in disgorgement? But I'll leave that for later in the podcast. This Qatari agent, man, some of this stuff was nuts because he had no skills. He was working on a success fee structure, which of course is a huge red flag for corruption, that you only get paid if your client, in this case Raytheon, wins the contract for the Qatari Air Force. Okay, so here he is with these sketchy compensation schemes. They realized by the late 2010s that this was getting out of hand. And Tom, where I said that Raytheon paid this person 30 million over the course of some 15 years, actually 17 million of that 30 million total was paid only in the spring of 2020 to basically get out of this arrangement right away and get rid of this guy, because that was when Raytheon was about to finally close its merger with United Technologies and be rebranded as UTX or RTX. That all happened in April of 2020. So just before that, in March 2020, Raytheon pays this guy 17 million basically to go away, but they then continued to have these residual activities with him where talk about documentation for your agents and what are they doing. He apparently provided next to none. So Raytheon wrote up the documentation for him, ghost wrote his own reports for Raytheon about what he was doing. And as late as April of 2022, that was 18 months ago, they still had the ghost of this Qatari agent. At one point, this agent demanded a commission for a contract that was arranged by the other relative who was running the sham defense studies that I mentioned 2 minutes ago. This Qatari agent wanted a commission based on that other corrupt deal from that other corrupt third party agent that Raytheon was also working with. At one point, the Raytheon employee who was ghostwriting the reports for the Qatari agent was not happy. So the Raytheon employee ghost wrote a complaint from the agent to senior management at Raytheon, who then directed that same employee to ghostwrite a complaint or an answer to the complaint back to the agent in some sort of Dilbertian perpetual motion machine. Nonsense. And one of Raytheon's counsel even said, this is priceless because this guy probably had the employee ghostwrite the complaint in the first place. That a lawyer put that in the email when he then said, now please have our employee ghostwrite the reply back to the agent. You go on and on. It's just, it's, I don't know if I want to make some joke about amateur hour or the Three Stooges or whatnot, because some of this seems so preposterous and over the top. And yet, Raytheon was not a small company. They were not an unsophisticated company. They were a heavily regulated defense contractor. And this went on all through the 2010s. Finally, it seems in 2022, ultimately, new leadership came in to RTX. New outside counsel came to RTX and Raytheon, which also makes me wonder what were the advice was Raytheon getting from outside counsel at this time? Where were the auditors at this time? We could go on with all the usual complaints. I'll stop there, Tom. It's just, on one hand, it's stuff you see in every single FCPA enforcement action with third parties and improper documentation and whatnot. On the other hand, when you actually read the complaint and the settlement order, it's astonishing the nonsense that went on at this company.
First of all, we have to acknowledge Dilbertian. Why use the Three Stooges when you have Dilbert? Maybe
I-
it's just uh, maybe it's just a difference in timing, subtle, but nevertheless, the first use of Dilbert on compliance into the weeds, I would note for the record, but Dilbertian it to a level of near Mount Rushmore greatness. Couple of things, Matt. The way I was really intrigued by and frankly impressed with the SEC order because they laid out everything you have talked about, but they laid it out in terms of here's how they failed in due diligence. Here's how they failed in the contracts, terms and conditions. Here's how they failed in the post contract signing phase of payments and fraudulent studies and other fallacies. And here's how they failed to do any auditing of these agents. We had really the first time I can recall the SEC laying out the steps for third party risk management and failure in all of those steps within the greater tale that you told. For some reason, the Department of Justice focused on 2014 to 2018, but the SEC complaint clearly brought it into the 2020s. So I was a little confused by that. As to your query early on about restitution, remember now we can only go back, or the The SEC can only go back 5 years. So they can't get
Fair enough.
restitution back more than 5 years ago. And I believe this conduct started as early as 2014, perhaps as early as 2012. The SEC order at least was almost a master class, I thought, in laying out the failures in the third party risk management program. Uh, I guess everyone at Raytheon except compliance was in on this. So a lot of the things I saw seemed to be to try to get around the formal requirements to appear to get comply with formal requirements of compliance, but not any of the substance. But as you correctly pointed out, we both know people who've worked at Raytheon. We've been with them at conferences. I don't think they knew this was going on, but they were certainly in an industry that had a well regulated oversight from the federal government in the form of defense contractors and had at least a large number of compliance professionals, if not robust. Let me turn to maybe some of the penalties, or at least the considerations. Number one, both the SEC and DOJ require monitors. Do you think this means two monitorships? Because I didn't see cross references to either monitorship in either the SEC order or the Department of Justice DPA. So that's sort of question one. Two is once again, Byzantine formula for determining the fines and penalties under the U.S. sentencing guidelines. It seemed that Raytheon was able to garner between 40 and $50 million discount for the credit they received, cooperation credit they received after they got religion. So once again, showing no matter how bad your conduct is, you can save a little bit of money. I didn't see anything in either the SEC order or the DOJ information or DPA around clawbacks and holdbacks. I saw termination of employees, but I didn't see anything for that new DOJ initiative. Any thoughts on maybe moving to the penalty phase that caught your attention?
So there's a couple of points there. My reading of all of these documents, and there are numerous, is that there will be two monitors because they are for essentially two different legal violations. The Justice Department monitor is for Raytheon's violation of the False Claims Act, where they were billing the Defense Department inflated costs for a Patriot missile system and a radar system worth a total of about $900 million, where in fact the actual cost for Raytheon was much less, and they did not disclose that to the Defense Department and covered up the fact that they were making more of a killing than was originally understood. So the DPA from the Justice Department applies to the False Claims Act instance, and there's a monitor there for that. And then meanwhile, there is a monitor for the Securities and Exchange Commission for the FCPA violations. And when you think about it, there are, I would argue that there are two different types of things you need to keep track of. So maybe you could want two different independent monitors here. A False Claims Act issue, and I was reading the DPA earlier today about it, that really is more about there were internal employees conspiring to not disclose to the Defense Department just how much Raytheon was underspending on its contract. It was underreporting or whatever, undervaluing, I think is the word. But that's a different sort of documentation and business process and internal controls you would need than vetting third party agents. There weren't any third party agents involved in the False Claims Act scheme. This FCPA violation in these issues here, this is third party due diligence pretty much all the way down. So I am not surprised about that. I also, Tom, did not see anything about clawback of executive pay. I did see a lot about termination of employees. But one other point I did want to call out, Tom, just to circle back to the SEC's enforcement order. In addition to laying out all of the things that went wrong with the internal controls and the documentation and the third party due diligence, the SEC settlement order also expressly calls out Raytheon's tone at the top. And I don't see that too often in SEC settlement orders where I'll have it right here. I can read it off. It's just two sentences, but they, Raytheon management, they believe that keeping Qatari agent happy was essential to obtaining revenue, which resulted in special treatment of the Qatari agent. The tone at the top of Raytheon and the relevant business units stressed keeping Qatari agent on board at all costs, without regard to the numerous red flags of corruption and compliance concerns. So I think it all ties in that also things did not change until Raytheon's management changed. The advisors to Raytheon changed. And I have to wonder also, you didn't see any credit for voluntary self disclosure because there was none. Why would there be? If this was the top and this was their tone, why on earth would they ever think that we should voluntarily disclose any number of the three different failures that we have? I think, Tom, you and I talked weeks ago when they had the ITAR violation from the State Department. That was about 6 weeks ago, and that's on a previous podcast. But multiple things going wrong at Raytheon, really a culture of disregard for good compliance at the top. And that all had to change. And now, meanwhile, we also have these very complicated and onerous penalties and remediations that still have to happen.
As I recall, this matter started with a SEC inquiry to Raytheon in 2019, and thereafter a parallel Department of Justice investigation began. But to your remarks on Raytheon management, the Securities and Exchange Commission also criticized him on the process of third-party risk management. And I want to quote here that said, quote, "These failures occurred against a backdrop of senior management indifference to the heightened corruption risk in connection with Raytheon's business in Qatar." It seems that senior management literally was either indifferent or actively working against compliance all the way through this process, Matt. And once again, we don't know who was terminated, and we don't have any information on clawbacks or holdbacks. And maybe because everybody cashed out when the merger happened. But it sure seems to me that there are some senior management who should have been called to task for this.
That also, I think, is very true. It makes me wonder the obvious question that asked so often in these scenarios: where was the board? Has the board changed its makeup or composition since then? Raytheon does have a dedicated committee to think about these sorts of issues separate from the audit committee. But okay, clearly the board will need to exercise more oversight. One of the reasons cited by the Justice Department in its decision to impose a monitor was that as of the time of this settlement, the compliance program had not yet been fully tested and proven to be able to detect future False Claims Act violations. The compliance program at Raytheon is still in a state of flux. Okay. Therefore, the board should be taking direct oversight of this to make sure that the compliance program is going to make all these remediations in a timely manner. And Tom, it's interesting that at the top of this podcast, you mentioned TD Bank, very different sort of offenses, very different sort of a company, but the regulators sanctioning TD Bank have been quite clear about how they want the board to really get into this up to its elbows in overseeing the rebuilding of its anti-money laundering compliance program. Fair enough. I think that makes sense, and it's urgent for the banking world, but it is no less urgent here in the defense world that the board really be called to task and make sure that management is taking care of compliance as necessary, which clearly prior management had not been, because they were cited in several instances by multiple regulators here about having a terrible tone at the top. Ultimately, that responsibility belongs to the board. And I haven't really seen too much discussion of where was the board? How are we going to make sure the board doesn't have this sort of oversight or turning a blind eye to the oversight problems in the future? And that's another question I have.
Well, Matt, here we are in 2024. Strikes me that the bribery schemes used in this could have been 2004, 2014, or 2024. You have reported on this in your blog, Radical Compliance, but listening to you and rereading your blog and preparing for this podcast, it also struck me that it's important that we continue to discuss the process failures so that compliance professionals can be hopefully ever vigilant in companies that actually do care. Would that I guess, how do you think about that?
One thing that struck me was, and Tom, refresh my memory here. When was the last time we had a huge mammoth FCPA enforcement action that involved a US company? I mean, we had for Goldman Sachs a couple of years ago. Good. Just the other week, the SEC imposed an order against Moog, which is a manufacturer that got into trouble for bribery in India. But that was a penalty of 1.7 million. But typically, $1 billion ish sort of a fine. I mean, we haven't seen that in a long time, or they're always foreign companies. I was just astonished to see that US companies can still not get it. And I don't recall exactly when Goldman Sachs FCPA misconduct ended, but I don't think it lingered into this decade like Raytheon just did. Uh, yeah, I struggle with this. It's more that what were these people thinking and why were they thinking that for so long? Maybe if this misconduct had happened in the 2000s and the year was 2013 and we're talking about wrapping it up, maybe I would still be impressed or astonished then. Now I'm speechless that a large US company would still be making these sort of basic errors in judgment. Yes, we think this is a good idea. Let's placate the agent no matter what. And engaging in these patently obvious schemes. And they were still doing it as late as 2018, 2019, 2020. I can't get over that.
Very Dilbertian.
Yes.
Matt, can't wait to see what next week brings us.
Thank you, Tom.